associated problems, the isolation, the lack of access to analytical equipment and so on and so forth. So he decided to abandon and joined industry. And so what I will do, nevertheless, present some of the initial results that Matt produced. And we did a field trip together with Marion and Alan Butcher and Matt, and we have some wonderful pictures of lithologies and rocks. And you will see it's really quite an exciting place. And we certainly plan to go back. Marion, Alan, myself, we will put another student on it and start from scratch, essentially. And I think Will is coming with me in August, hopefully, to look at this place. So we're talking about the Llyn Peninsula now. This is the Llyn Peninsula here in North Wales. Sorry, this is where we are here. So the guys who were with me and Christian yesterday in West Wales at St. David's, there's St. David's Head. And remember, Wales here, certainly West Wales in sort of tectonic context represents comparable to perhaps a modern Andean style environment. Subduction here of the closure of the Iapetus Ocean during the Ordovician and also then into the Devonian Silurian. Closure of the Iapetus and subduction here, eastward subduction generating intensive volcanism, most prominently here in Snowdonia and on the Llyn Peninsula, Anglesey, but also here in this little bit in this tip here of West Wales. So we have in the Ordovician then, we have of course the famous volcanoes here in Snowdonia, alkaline many of them, rhyolitic also, and we have two-layered intrusions, West St. David's Head here and on the Llyn Peninsula. The Welsh name is Llyn Peninsula, but we sort of, to make things easier, we just call it the Rhiw layered intrusion, or the Rhiw Gabbro. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. We can skip about this text here. I don't have so much time. I don't want to keep you too much, but there's the intrusion. It's about close to 10 kilometers long, and it's quite thin. There's a picture. We did some beautiful drone coverage of this thing. I'll show you some detailed pictures in a moment here. So you see the ultramafic rocks. This is a 250 meter thick sill-like body that has actually a significant ultramafic portion in contrast to St. David's Head that we saw yesterday. So there is about 70 meters or so of ultramafic rocks. The basal contact of the intrusion comes down here, and then it comes down to the coast here. So ultramafic rocks from the base to about 70 meters here, where there's the contact somewhere here, to the mafic rocks, and then mafic rocks, layered mafic rocks, gabbroic rocks predominantly here, and then granophyric rocks towards the top. So not very thick, 10 kilometers long. So the dimensions of the intrusion, it's a sill-like body essentially. Very interesting textures I will show you in a moment. So as you can see here already, and I'll show you details of that, the contact between the ultramafic and the mafic portion of that intrusion, very, very sharp, and some interesting things there to be seen. The last paper that was published on Rhiw was in 1976, so it hasn't been studied in 50 years, quite amazingly. I think the first who looked at it was Harker in 1885 or 1888, something like that. Marion dug out a paper and some samples, I think at Cambridge. But essentially, 1976, that was largely a petrographic description. So there was virtually no whole rock chemical data available from this body. That's what made it so attractive for us to study. And so the other thing is, so here, when you look, as I told you, the basal contact of the intrusion goes down here, and then it comes to the coast and is actually exposed on the beach. But if you want to look at that basal contact, you need to go there when the tides are low, because otherwise the basal contact is covered. So the contact is exposed actually, and there are also boulders, large boulders from half a meter to about 5 meters that fell down just from about 3-4 meters above the beach, the pebble beach. From the cliff, we can see where it fell down, and these big boulders lying on the beach for us to study, we want to go there with a micro drill and sample those in detail. So this is an example here of a large boulder about 1 meter across of the chilled margin actually of the intrusion. So the base of the intrusion here would be right here. There's a bit of a fine-grained chilled margin here. The composition of the magma is about 7% MgO, so it's broadly like Rhiw, like St. David's Head, a little bit more primitive than St. David's Head. 7% MgO, maybe 250 ppm chromium. So it's a basalt essentially. And I will show you in a moment and argue in a moment that it's a calc-alkaline basalt. It's got amphibole in its significant amphibole. But yeah, so the interesting thing is in this boulder, as you can see, there's some distinct layering at the base of the intrusion, right at the base above the chill. I interpret this to be a result of boundary layer crystallization. Alternative, yeah, so there is a phase here, a thin layer that you could argue represents a quenched product of a new magma influx or magma overturn, boundary layer crystallization, right? So those are the two models that we were hoping Matt would test. And so what we're going to do is we take a micro drill and drill through this thing here, 2 or 3 little holes through this thing to study this in detail. Well, you know, it looks a bit similar to Skaergård, the layering, arguably boundary layer crystallization in Skaergård layering. What's also really interesting, also associated, exposed here in large boulders that are accessible, but then also directly above us in the cliff, is actually where the magma, the interaction of the magma with the pelitic sediments just below it. So you have here this sort of very textured gabbroic rocks, fine-grained, coarser-grained. There are some parts of it that look like the chilled margin still, but that have injected and sort of partially digesting the pelitic host rocks. You can see them being present here as rafts, dismembered and partially melting rafts. You see some felsic phases here that could be partial melts of these mudstones. So very complex. And again, we are aiming to characterize in a little bit more detail what's happening here during the partial melting with micro drilling. There's another example here. And then this is a boulder, one of these 5-meter boulders that fell just from above onto the beach. And the basal contact of the intrusion is right here. I'll show you a detail in a moment. There's the base to the mudstones, the chilled margin here. And then it goes relatively quickly. So within a few meters already, we have ultramafic, mafic interlayering, as you can see. So this is quite remarkable. In a small intrusion like this, just 200 meters thick, we move from the chilled margin into interlayered mafic, ultramafic rocks. And we can, because we know where the chill is, where the base is, we can actually study the nature of the layering here. And first there's the detail of the contact actually, and you see these little plumes of the sediments that inject into the chilled margin. It's quite interesting. And there seems to be a little bit of an alteration associated with that in the chilled margin. So there is this close-up from this big boulder that you saw a moment ago. We can see that actually the base of these ultramafic layers show these undulations that we see in other layered intrusions and are commonly interpreted as potholes in other layered intrusions. Potholes resulting from either thermal erosion, perhaps, or dissolution of the floor rocks, chemical dissolution. We're not entirely sure. We've been discussing this for 50 years, the origin of potholes. So this resembles it a little bit. So there is now a picture from the beach where we went. We were lucky that we picked a nice day and a low tide. So to access a part of the chilled margin, you have to actually quickly swim through this channel here. This is Matt, and then the contact is directly exposed here on the other side. Here you can see it. That's the mudstone to the chilled margin. And already 2 meters above that contact, we find this intense, this interlayering of mafic, ultramafic rocks. When you look at it in detail, there are these about 2-3 meters above the margin. There's this horizon here that I think what's happening here is these maybe partial melts of the floor rocks of the sediments, quite felsic in places, that inject up into the intrusion and form these sort of broadly bedding parallel felsic layers. Unfortunately, we didn't study this in detail yet. We didn't drill it when we were there. This was a reconnaissance trip, and unfortunately, of course, now this project has stalled for the moment. So we need to go back there and micro drill these horizons too. There is a close-up. So we're just 2-3 meters above the base of the intrusion here. This sort of very complicated injection of felsic material into the melanocratic, melagabbro, or even peridotitic material. Here's some close-up of these things in there too. You see, so it seems to be. I cannot actually be sure whether this is partial melts of the country rocks, or this could be simply a very intense fractionation that produces these felsic upper portions here that then inject a little bit, it seems, flame-like into the overlying ultramafic rocks. Again, this is something we see in other layered intrusions too. And here you see these beautiful undulating contacts of the ultramafic layers into its more leucocratic floor rocks. Yeah, and then when we go to the peridotite, the 70-meter peridotite on top of it is this sort of very oikocristic peridotite. He called it egg box weathering, I think. So the plagioclase oikocrysts stand out. That's how they look on the beach in these big boulders. Beautiful oikocrysts, plagioclase oikocrysts in an olivine, predominantly olivine, and also orthopyroxene matrix. Under the microscope, they are, many of them, most samples are actually quite unaltered. So that's the beauty about this intrusion. We can do mineral chemistry and, model the intrusion quite nicely. So Matt produced about 20 thin sections, 20 samples to this, and unfortunately I don't have them, so they are with him still. But I managed to take some photographs before he disappeared. And so this is an example here where you have essentially, I'd say it's a lertzolite. So olivine, there's some olivine, some clinopyroxene. In this case, quite strongly altered, serpentinized, but there's an orthopyroxene here that shows this very complex zonation, and it's rimmed and embedded within hornblende. So I guess I wonder, you guys may be aware there was a couple of years ago, Steve Barnes and Schönefeld, they produced a paper where they suggested that in magma conduits where we have very sort of rapidly changing and complicated chemical gradients, we tend to find these sort of complexly zoned pyroxenes. And Steve and his colleagues, they argue that this could be a tool by which we identify highly dynamic conduits that could be more prospective for nickel copper, magmatic nickel copper mineralization. So of course, when you look at this sort of thing, that made us wonder, could we be looking rather than a sort of a stagnant sill-like body here, closed system, more like at an open system, a conduit-like system through which, with a more dynamic magmatic environment. We didn't even I don't even have chemical data from this from these minerals yet, so we have to start from scratch and look at these things. Yeah, so some pictures here of these lertzolites or harzburgites locally. They tend to be quite layered, and then we're coming into the mafic rocks. They, like in the Bushveld and other layered intrusions, first we have these sort of horizons where we have these sort of Schlieren-like, lens-like mafic patches in a more felsic gabbro or leucocratic gabbro, and then overlain by very nicely banded gabbro that actually shows inch-scale layering in places, and all that in a 200-meter intrusion. Really quite amazing. So, people have interpreted, including myself, have interpreted this sort of thing as granular flow and mushes that are that are sorted and unsorted during flow in these intrusions. This is a boulder again from the beach where you can see there's a little pegmatoidal veins that seem to have indented upwards, I assume, although it's a pebble, we can't be sure, have indented the overlying leucocratic layer. And there are these sort of, it looks like cross-bedding magmatic sediments, what we saw in St. David's intrusion yesterday. Another sample here where these lens-like leucocratic layers in a more melanocratic gabbro. Then some of these leucocratic gabbros, they tend to be intensely quite folded and deformed. I'll show you another picture from the drone in a moment. And again, we find that in other late intrusions too. A drum is a classic example, of course, where we find intensely folded cumulates, which Emilius and others have argued that that represents a slumping of crystal mushes. And so the drone, these are, sorry, that's still a field picture where we actually saw the contact between the ultramafic and the gabbroic phase then at about 70 meters stratigraphic height. It's a bit tricky to go there, unfortunately. So I didn't want to chase Matt down there. But we have drone coverage of this, and I'm tempted that somehow we must find a way to be able to sample this. So I'm thinking about that, maybe with some ropes or something. But the beautiful drone pictures that was done from what's his name again? Sorry, I forgot now. In Aberdeen, our colleague in Aberdeen, and so we have beautiful pictures here of the contact. So there, the mafic ultramafic contact. Actually, let me show this again. So we are looking. Sorry, it's still coming. Where is it? Ah, here it is. So that's we're looking at this contact now here. Contact between ultramafic and mafic rocks, and the drone picture picks up then these interlayered gabbroic rocks that and they have a pegmatoidal layer just above them that is exposed here in this outcrop. So first you have layered gabbro and then intensely deformed gabbro. This seems to be an otolith, I think, possibly of the peridotites just below. Everything is folding and flowing around it quite intensely folded here. So we see exactly the same thing in the mafic ultramafic transition zone of the Bushveld complex. And Chris Jenkins tells me that at Stillwater, similar things happen in that transition zone. But there's this weird pegmatoidal layer of about 2 meters that sits right on top of this deformed interval. Again, I can't comment really too much on it at the moment, what that means. And there's some inch scale layering here. I was really surprised to find all these things in a 200-meter sill. Then there is what Matt and Alan Butcher have optimistically called the ozone. It's a very strongly oxidized and stained, iron-stained layer of about 2 meters thickness that contains quite abundant sulfides. We haven't studied it in detail yet. I think there is some pyrite in there, but certainly a lot of chalcopyrite too. And so this needs to be studied. It's more or less at the horizon where you would expect that the magma reaches sulfur saturation. Very often it happens in the upper third of the intrusion. So there's the drone picture again. And then the last two pictures here, some initial geochemistry, whole rock geochemistry from Matt, showing you that, yes, we have this, he didn't study the entire intrusion yet, but we 120-meter section from the ultramafic rocks into these layered gabbroic rocks and unlayered gabbroic rocks to top. So we have typically here these 30% MgO at the bottom in these peridotites. There's a chilled margin, chromium contents here. Yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail. There's not a lot of copper in there, not a lot of sulfur at all in there, but as you can see, the coverage is not complete, so this remains to be determined whether in the end we do not have more significant sulfur and copper. And of course we wanted to do PG contents too, not that we expect a major reef there, but we wanted to check that too. So all these things remain to be done, and I think that's enough for a little introduction into this intrusion, and open to some questions if you want.
Your last slide, where is the ore zone?
Say again, please.
On that last slide, where is the ore zone?
So the ore zone is, I think, where this copper peaks here. This one, where we have a little bit higher sulfur and copper, but he didn't analyze the precise, the center of the ore zone because it's so altered. He took a sample right next to it. Yeah, Marion?
One of the astonishing things about that outcrop is how thin it is, and yet how much evidence there is for dynamic behavior, for slumping, for movement of the mush, which seems very surprising for something that's truly only a couple of 100 meters thick. So one of the things we were discussing was whether we're looking at the thin margin of a much bigger body that's underwater, that's much thicker, that was shaken around by earthquakes like Rhiw was. Did Matt follow that through to look for geophysical evidence for more of it offshore?
Yes, he tried to find some data, and it was a bit inconclusive. That's all I can say. So no clear evidence that it extends widely into the ocean, but the data is not very extensive there. So that remains to be tested. I think Chris was next.
Yeah, Wolfgang, everything you're showing there reminds me of the Llyn Peninsula intrusion in Norway. I think the calc-alkaline sort of parental magma setting and the anti-ball bearing automatic and mafic rocks. And I think that the general geological setting in the Caledonian closure settings is similar to what I have seen visiting the Llyn Peninsula.
But that's much thicker, right?
That's much thicker. And I was just thinking about this. I can't remember, but kilometers. If it's 4 or 5, something like this, if you sort of But
Yeah.
one of the things that is characteristic of the Fongenhülling is that the end product is a cyanide and not a granite.
Well, they have a
So-
granifier.
so do you have any, you said there was a granifier on top?
Yeah, but that's a purely textural identification. You know, we haven't analyzed that granifier yet, unfortunately.
Interesting to see.
Yeah,
Really.
that's a good point.
Richard Wilson, who studied
Yeah.
the Fongenhülling for
Yeah.
decades, I mean, he was always pointing this out with the cyanidic
Yes.
product, which is fairly unusual.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good point. We haven't. We need to look at this.
Some of these things you show, they look, I
Mm.
mean, Richard Wilson has these beautiful lobe structures where you sort of see automatic layers
Mm.
clearly foundering into the more plagioclase rich layers below. And it, at least from the first glance, some of the
Mm.
pictures you showed reminded me of that.
Yeah,
So there's tons of similarities.
yeah. And what's also interesting is that it's so different to St. David's head, although the chilled margins have very similar compositions. So I find that also weird.
Yeah.
Alan?
Yeah, I mean, going back to this deformation, you're showing this as sort of a typical horizontally intruded, but could have been intruded on something that says that it's growing on a slope. So you can get deformation that way.
Yeah, so Steve Barnes, I think, made that contact when we were at St. David's Head that, you know, we're talking about sills, but of course these sills can locally be plunging, so allowing us some deformation of mushes, arguably. So, yeah.
I just wondered if you had any other independent evidence that it was either horizontal or.
I think Marian, when we were down there at the beach, you know, we saw these sort of channels that indicate certainly a flow direction of the magma. So they had these, we actually looked down, we looked up onto the basal contact at the beach. You can do that in places. And you see that locally it forms, what are they called? You know, these sort of almost like ripples, like mega ripples. And we argued this could indicate that the flow of the magma in sort of this direction. But of course, no, that doesn't tell us whether there is a slope. We couldn't determine whether there's a slope of the magma. So, you know, I mean, yeah, microtextural work is another thing that needs to be done to determine whether some of this layering, some of the interlayering is the result of mushes, of crystal mushes, slumping of crystal mushes, or solid state ductile deformation. We haven't done any of this yet. So,
What?
yeah.
You have this chill, basal chill. What about the upper contact? Do you have contact?
So the upper contact is not exposed. It's in some of the papers, in some of the early papers, it mentions there's an upper contact, but we couldn't find it when we looked at it. We were there 2 days and looked for it. And
It's not that fast still.
no, but it's heavily vegetated, the upper contact area. So we couldn't really clearly find it. A bit more work. I'm sure one could find it with a dedicated student. Not me in my age anymore. Ivan.
Your opinion, how can we explain the strong deformation of the gabbro department with the pigment?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer.
We have something like this in intrusion I study.
So then you tell me. I haven't thought about that yet, Ivan.
See, that's scabbard above the really big gabbro pegmatites, and the general understanding is it's diapiric uplift of within, you know, quite a ductile leaf.
Okay, so yeah, we saw that, of course, in the one beach boulder, that where the pegmatidal lenses go up, they cause some deformation. So perhaps the pegmatite, you know, intruded upwards and spread out and caused some deformation in the gabbro, but then spread out right on top of it or between it, something like that. But I really don't know yet at the moment. Was there somebody else? Yes.
Hello, I just interested in the interaction between the sedimentary and the magmatic. Yeah, when touching the magma experiment, the sediment is consolidated, and it's just the melting of the sedimentary. It just there is a fluidization of the sedimentary, and it may be like the filtering.
Yeah, so firstly, what I forgot to say actually is the sediments contain sulfides. Not rare, we see little concretions of sulfidic material. So in that regard, it's quite surprising that the chilled margin, there's no evidence of certainly visible sulfides in the chilled margin, and Matt, I think his analysis sort of 500 ppm the highest. So that is firstly surprises me that, you know, the sediments are sulfide rich, but there's no evidence of sulfide in the intrusion visible at all. So, but when it comes to, yeah, we can see in the boulders there in the front that the intrusion has, even that it was only 200 meters wide, that it has triggered partial melting of the sulfides. It injected into the sulfides. It seems that they were incompletely consolidated, because it sort of, you know, causes the zone of mingling and melting and everything. It's quite complex. And the other thing, by the way, that hasn't been done yet is the age. Just like St. David's Head, we assume it's Ordovician because it hasn't been in place in Ordovician samples, and because the magmatism in the area, the whole Snowdonia, all these volcanoes are Ordovician, but we haven't got a precise age yet of it. So that's amazing. Both St. David's Head, of course, and Rhiw needs to be dated, and that was the plan. And we have samples that are datable, and we will do that soon.
Well,
Yes.
I have a question. Why the pegmatite of gabbros occurring just the separation of the ultramafic?
Yeah, at the base, these sort of felsic phases. Yeah, I interpret them to be, again, we haven't looked at them in detail yet, but I interpret them to be possibly partial melts of these mudstones, of these pilitic rocks. You know, so very felsic, perhaps even approaching granitic compositions, but we haven't looked at that, unfortunately, yet. So we need to go there with a micro drill, because that exposure is virtually, you know, you can't hammer it. And in fact, we're not even allowed to hammer it. Of course, that's another issue, like those who were with me yesterday at St. David's. All our coasts are SSI exposures. We need permission from the government and the survey to do work there. And so hammering is an issue. But the beauty, of course, is that we can micro drill these boulders on the beach. I don't think there's any objection from the government to that. Marion.
It was the pegmatites, you know, on that really terrifying outcrop on the coast
Yeah.
with the slope, with the blocks.
Yeah.
It's that pegmatite, the really, really
Yeah.
coarse grained pegmatite.
Yes.
It's not the.
Okay, so that were you talking about that one, the one further up, or the ones are right at the bottom? Okay. Yeah. What about that one?
Red one.
Yeah, that's
I see. Okay. Yeah. So it's these amphiboles can be up to 20 centimeters long, very, very coarse grained. We do not have a whole rock analysis of it, and in any case, it's going to be very tricky to do a representative whole rock analysis. But remember yesterday at St. David's Head, there's a similar pegmatite at more or less the same horizon. And that, based on Bevan's old analysis, is not particularly enriched in incompatible trace elements. So we were discussing then, therefore, could it just be a volatile triggered recrystallization, not introducing, you know, phosphorus, zircon.
It's like a coral, like parasite.
Yeah, this stuff looks like it, yeah. Yeah. When you look at the.
It's not a recrystallization, it looks like primary growth.
Yeah.
These things, yeah, they're like primary growth, and they're growing like coral reef.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
The problem is, you know, to get there will be tricky. To this specific place, we need to go. This is a drone picture. Amazing what the drones can do these days, huh? The resolution. That's fascinating. So yeah, we need to get there. I don't know how to do this yet. We make a plan. Any other questions? Yes, John.
The other place I've been that looks very like this is the Adamello. It's hanging out, really more accessible. These huge pegmatites, I mean everything, and that's a alkaline making ultimate lead intrusion. The parent magma is quite wet and gritty. And there are these pegmatite layers, the bright pegmatites, which huge.